All right, welcome back to the Organic Ministry Project, and what better week than to tackle a big topic like racism? All right, so we start off the week with Martin Luther King Day, and we end the week with the inauguration of a president who's been stoking the fires of racism here for the past year. Now, racism is one of those topics that a lot of people don't want to talk about, especially when you're a middle-class white guy who really doesn't understand the whole thing to begin with. But I spent some time this week connecting with some friends of mine who enlightened me about the whole topic of racism, and we had some great conversations. If you want to hear some of those conversations, check out my podcast on Podbean. Now, as I said last week, I'm following the sermon series called Taboo by Carl Hafner at the Kettering Adventist Church. So if you haven't heard that sermon or you want to follow along with those, go to ketsda.org and you can find all of that there. Now, don't worry, I talked with Carl. I've got his permission to troll his sermon series, and I'm going to try and fill in the blanks of some of the things that he wasn't able to get to in the sermon, or maybe he just flat out avoided. So let's start off with the big one. How can Christians support slavery? Now, if you think about it, Christianity has a long history of slavery. In my opinion, it comes from the fact that Christianity as an institution is set up to separate the sheep from the goats. It wants to make one person better than the other. So we as human beings, as flawed individuals, naturally start separating other people and looking for reasons to do that to make ourselves better than others. Now, where does the Bible come into all of this? Well, believe it or not, people actually have texts in the Bible that support discriminating against other people based on their skin color. When the first slave ships started deporting Incas and Mayas back to Spain and bringing Africans over to the U.S. colonies to put them into slavery, they were using some very specific texts from the Bible to support what they were doing to dehumanize other individuals for their own personal gain. So here you go. The first Bible verse is in Genesis chapter 4. That's the story of Cain and Abel. Now, after Cain kills Abel, God shows up and asks Cain what's going on. Cain lies to God, says, I don't know what's going on. I just found him this way. God winds up cursing Cain and telling him that he's putting a mark on him that can be seen from a distance. So a lot of people take that verse and say, well, that's a skin color thing. He made Cain stand out from everybody else. Now, the problem with that, that's a very Anglo-Saxon way of looking at it. And remember, Anglo-Saxons are the ones that wrote the Bible and put the whole thing together. So, of course, they're going to say that the mark that you could see from a distance was him being made a black man. Now, another verse that comes up a little bit later on is Genesis chapter 9, right after the flood. Now, that's where Noah plants a vineyard, he winds up growing his own grapes, making wine, getting drunk, and then passing out in his tent. Now, his son Ham winds up wandering in and seeing the nakedness of his father. Now, there's a lot of things that we can talk about in that, what that actually means. There's some subversive language there that some scholars think might have been something else, but we're just going to go with afterwards, Noah curses his son and puts a mark on him. Again, people look at that and say, oh, well, it's a curse. He changed his skin color. Leap forward a couple hundred years and you've got the book of Leviticus, you've got the books of Deuteronomy that are telling the Israelites how to treat slaves. So a lot of people take those three things together, dehumanizing people of a different color because that's a curse, and then taking the text from Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy and saying, look, we're allowed to have slaves. The Bible says we can. The problem with the text in Leviticus and Deuteronomy laying out the laws on how to treat slaves, how long you can have them, and all of that, it all comes back to God wanting to remind the children of Israel that they were slaves once, and they were mistreated, abused, murdered, killed, and all of that. So if they were going to have slaves, which was very common when you conquered another nation, you made slaves, those slaves needed to be treated better than the way that they were treated in Egypt. It had nothing to do with skin color. But remember those curses, the curse of Cain and the curse of Ham. Now you've got a biblical explanation why good God-fearing people in the United States of America, Christian people, would support slavery for so many years. It's that dogma that winds up bleeding through into us today, and we don't even realize where it came from. It's this old dogma, this antiquated teaching that no one can explain anymore that tells us that people of color are not equal of value. Now, another thing that Carl hinted at in his sermon was the racial divide within the Adventist church. Now, I would venture to say that a lot of young people today don't even realize that there's two different conferences within the Adventist church. There's a conference for white people, and there's a conference for ethnic groups, primarily African American churches. Now, that started off during the Civil Rights Movement, where the Adventist church wanted to provide African American churches an opportunity to have their own leadership within the general conference structure. And while segregation was still a part of everything and desegregation was slowly taking hold, it was a way for those churches to manage their finances, have equal representation within the general conference body. But the problem is, today it still exists. And a lot of young people within the churches, they look around and they say there's black churches, there's white churches, and then they wind up realizing that there's a segregation in the authority of the church. That's where the problem exists. The separate conferences are not a racist issue. I don't believe that the General Conference is sitting there going, black churches, Hispanic churches, Korean churches, white churches, they're all different and the white churches are better and have more authority than the black churches. That's not what's going on. What has happened at this point is politics. As usual, this is the flaws of sinful human beings running an organization that is designed to build a heavenly kingdom not existent of this world with ideals that don't match with a sinful culture. So think about it this way. If you've got a merger of two organizations, the thing that you got to figure out is who's going to be in charge when you merge the whole thing. Somebody's going to get laid off. You can't have two CEOs. You can't have two CFOs. You can't have two boards and all of that. So you got to figure out who's getting laid off and who's staying on. So the reason that we have segregation within the church today is all about power. Nobody wants to admit it, but that's the way it comes down. Nobody wants to give up their job so that we can have unity within the church. In 2015, a group of students from Andrews University wrote a letter to the North American Division asking them why this exists. The North American Division responded with a note that said, "We affirm the establishment of the regional conferences is set forth in the 1944 General Conference session, and they see no reason to change that at this time, even though they will work to continue with cooperation and growth with the regional churches." Now, if you're a young person of color, if you're a young Adventist that's wondering why we still have this thing going on, that's why. It's all about bureaucracy. It's all about politics and humans striving to find their power position within the church structure. Now, does that existing today serve any positive purpose? No. And in my opinion, those sorts of things, those antiquated structures that we're not willing to get rid of, are part of the reasons why people no longer want to be part of that old church structure and they're leaving. So what should you do? I've put the link to the article about the North American Division's response to the Andrews University students in the comments below. If this is something that you are passionate about, racism within the church, or the appearance of racism within the church, because I was raised, my dad always told me, avoid the appearance of evil. And whether it is deliberate or unintentional, the separation of African American churches and white churches within the Adventist denominations appears racist, especially to a young generation that is striving to find reconciliation, that is striving to find peace and equality across all genders, across all races and ethnicities. And when you're a church that has hung its hat on belittling minorities, you've got a problem. Christianity as a whole has a problem with racism. But I believe that that is historical, and I don't believe it's the modern norm. I believe that as more and more people ask the questions and challenge the system, whether it's politically, whether it's religiously, or whether it's culturally, that we can bring about change that people are just not aware of needs to happen. People are living in ignorance right now, and fear of change creates more ignorance. Racism is alive and well. A lot of it is just habit. We don't even realize we're doing it anymore. But a new generation is coming that is asking the questions and is wanting to make a change. If you're wanting to make a change, do this. Ask questions. Find friends that are not the same color as you and start this conversation. Create a movement that does not allow biases to be made out of ignorance because you didn't take the time to build a relationship with somebody that doesn't have the same skin color as you. And then the next thing is go to your leaders, whether it's at church, whether it's in politics, your mayor, your governor, your senator, whoever it might be, and tell them we want change because we believe that all men are created equally. When we take time to break down walls, to pull people outside of boxes, to take ourselves outside of the little box that we've put ourselves in and challenge our own thoughts in the historical context that we've been taught, we can change the world. So I hope this helped you out with your racism discussions for the week. I challenge you to continue watching the sermon series with Carl Hafner and the Kettering Adventist Church. This week is on politics. It's going to be fun seeing what all happens with the inauguration of Donald Trump and the conversations that come from that. But don't let the conversation stop. Find somebody who's different from you. Have a conversation, because that's how organic change happens. Thanks a lot. Have a great week.